Before the documentary begins, I would like to provide a brief in a few lines first on the title, Assyrian Empire, the Ruthless Power That Changed History Forever. They were the masters of fear, the architects of terror, and the first empire to rule through absolute domination. Their enemies whispered their name in the dark, Ashur, Assyria. From blood-soaked battlefields to towering stone cities carved with the screams of the conquered, the Assyrians didn't just build an empire. They engineered a machine of power. Their kings believed they were chosen by the gods, unstoppable, unbreakable, and destined to rule the world. But how did a single city on the banks of the Tigris rise to command the ancient Near East? How did they transform from humble settlers into the deadliest warlords of antiquity? And what was the secret behind their terrifying rise and their sudden brutal fall? Because when you understand the Assyrians, you understand the blueprint of every empire that came after. Before we uncover the brutal truth behind the Assyrian war machine, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Join us as we dive deep into the rise and fall of ancient powers, where history bleeds and legends never die. Let us begin the complete documentary on the title Assyrian Empire, the Ruthless Power That Changed History Forever. Long before the Assyrians were known as masters of conquest, they were simply survivors on the harsh plains of northern Mesopotamia. The land was both gift and punishment, fertile near the rivers, yet unforgiving beyond them. The Tigris cut through the landscape like a lifeline, bringing both sustenance and danger. Around it, the early Assyrians built their homes, their walls, and their gods. Their world revolved around the city of Ashur, a small but sacred settlement perched on the west bank of the Tigris. It was here that the roots of one of history's most formidable empires took hold. The people who lived there believed they were chosen, set apart from others, for Ashur was not merely a city, it was divine. The god Ashur, both patron and protector, was seen as the embodiment of the land itself. Every stone, every wall, every breath within the city belonged to him. To live in Ashur was to live for Ashur. The rulers were not kings in the usual sense, but servants of their god's will. Conquest, expansion, and domination were not ambitions. They were obligations, sacred duties commanded by the divine. Every field they plowed, every battle they fought, every tribute they collected was offered to Ashur as a sign of loyalty. In this belief lay the foundation of an empire unlike any before it. Power for the Assyrians was not merely political or military, it was spiritual. To conquer another land was to extend the god's dominion. To lose was to commit sacrilege. The early Assyrians were clever observers of the world around them. They learned from those who came before and beside them, the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Hittites. From the Sumerians, they took the art of writing, pressing wedge-shaped symbols into wet clay, recording everything from trade transactions to royal decrees. From the Babylonians, they inherited a sense of governance and order, understanding that an empire could not stand on the sword alone. From the Hittites, they borrowed the chariot, a thunderous innovation that would one day make their armies legendary. Piece by piece, the Assyrians absorbed knowledge like a sponge, reshaping it into something harder, sharper, and more disciplined. By around 1800 BCE, under King Shamshi-Adad IV, Assyria began to rise from obscurity. Shamshi-Adad was not content to rule a single city. He envisioned a kingdom stretching across Mesopotamia, one unified under Ashur's divine light. He fortified cities, built temples, and placed loyal governors in key regions. Trade flourished under his rule, connecting Assyria to lands as distant as Anatolia and the Levant. Caravans carried tin, textiles, and lapis lazuli along the routes, enriching the kingdom. But wealth was not his ultimate goal. Power was. Shamshi-Adad's ambition was to build an empire of permanence, and his methods were both strategic and ruthless. He forged alliances through marriage and diplomacy, but when those failed, he sent his armies to remind the hesitant of Assyria's strength. For a time, his vision held. The Assyrian kingdom grew in influence and fear. Cities bowed and merchants prospered. Yet, as history often shows, empire is a fragile dream. When Shamshi-Adad died, the unity he had carved began to fracture. His sons lacked his resolve and foresight, and his empire crumbled under the pressure of internal weakness and foreign aggression. The Babylonians, powerful and patient, moved swiftly to reclaim what they considered theirs. The Assyrian flame, once burning bright, flickered and dimmed. For centuries, Assyria seemed to vanish from prominence. But this was not death. It was hibernation. Beneath the surface, its people endured, hardened by loss, waiting for the right moment to rise again. They rebuilt quietly, strengthening their walls, sharpening their weapons, and preserving their gods' memory. While other civilizations declined, Assyria learned from failure. The people became disciplined, their kings more pragmatic, their priests more zealous. They saw that survival was not enough. Domination was the only path to ensure they would never again kneel before another power. When the Middle Assyrian period began around 1350 BCE, a new breed of rulers emerged, more militarized, more methodical, more relentless. Kings like Ashur-uballit I and Tukulti-Ninurta I reasserted Assyria's power across Mesopotamia. They revived Shamshi-Adad's dream, but infused it with new ferocity. Tukulti-Ninurta marched south to Babylon, captured its king, and claimed the title King of Sumer and Akkad, a declaration that Assyria was now the dominant force in the ancient world. This conquest was not just military, it was symbolic. Babylon had long been the cultural and spiritual heart of Mesopotamia. To seize it was to seize history itself. The victory, however, came at a cost. The gods of Babylon were enraged, the priests outraged, and rebellions simmered. But Tukulti-Ninurta saw himself as chosen, even beyond divine reproach. He constructed new cities, built temples, and expanded trade. Yet his own people eventually turned on him, assassinating him in his palace, a chilling foreshadowing of what would one day happen to his empire. Still, the groundwork had been laid. By now, the Assyrians had learned the cruel mathematics of power, that fear could rule where diplomacy failed, that discipline could outlast chaos, and that control was the truest form of faith. They began to refine warfare into science. Armies were organized, logistics planned, and conquests recorded meticulously. The image of the Assyrian warrior, clad in bronze and carrying a spear marked with Ashur's emblem, became a symbol of inevitability. Every campaign was not just a war, but a ritual, an act of devotion. What made the Assyrians different from their contemporaries was their patience. They did not rise in bursts of chaos and collapse into anarchy. They evolved, slowly, deliberately, ruthlessly. Every defeat was studied, every rebellion punished, every lesson carved into their collective memory. Over generations, this hardened the Assyrian spirit. Where others saw destruction, they saw purification. Where others sought peace, they sought permanence. By the end of this period, the Assyrians had transformed themselves from survivors into strategists, from subjects into rulers, from worshippers into instruments of their God's will. Their cities were no longer fragile outposts, but fortified symbols of control. Their temples were not places of prayer, but centers of command. Their kings were not simply rulers. They were divine executors of destiny. And as the world around them faltered, as the Hittites fell, as Egypt turned inward, as Babylon grew weak, Assyria stood ready. The earth was changing. The Bronze Age had ended, giving way to the Iron Age. And with iron came a new kind of warfare, faster, deadlier, more efficient. For the Assyrians, it was as if the gods themselves had given them the weapon they had long awaited. The river city of Ashur had birthed something that would soon shake the ancient world. Its faith had turned to fire, its people to steel. The Assyrians no longer looked to the heavens for permission. They looked to the horizon for conquest. The world had forgotten them once. They would make sure it never forgot them again. In that moment, as dawn broke over the plains of northern Mesopotamia, a new age began, one that would see the rise of the first true military empire. forged not by chance but by belief, discipline, and the unyielding conviction that they were destined to rule. What had begun as devotion would soon become domination. The birth of fear had begun. The rebirth of Assyria was not a coincidence of history. It was a calculated emergence, a deliberate transformation into something far beyond a kingdom. The Assyrians understood that survival alone was weakness, and to rule the world, one had to build a machine that could never stop. That machine was their empire. It was not powered by mercy or chance, but by design. Every soldier, every worker, every scribe, every god served a single, unyielding system. When the Neo-Assyrian Empire began to rise around 900 BCE, it did so with a ferocity and precision the ancient world had never witnessed before. The kings who ruled it believed themselves chosen by Ashur not merely to protect Assyria, but to conquer the earth itself. Ashur-nasir-pal II, the architect of terror, was among the first to understand that fear was more powerful than the sword. He marched his armies farther than any before him, crushing rebellions, subduing cities, and enslaving entire populations. He knew that conquest without message was temporary, but conquest with memory was eternal. When his soldiers flayed prisoners alive or impaled rebels on wooden stakes, he ordered these acts carved into stone reliefs across palace walls. It was not mere cruelty. It was communication, a warning etched in eternity. The sight of those carvings, bathed in torchlight, told every visitor that resistance against Assyria was not bravery, but suicide. The Assyrian army was unlike any other in the ancient world. It was not a group of warriors gathered for seasonal campaigns. It was a professional institution, standing year-round, trained, paid, and maintained by the state. Soldiers were specialized: archers, charioteers, infantry, engineers. Siege warfare became their art. They learned how to undermine city walls, construct siege ramps, and batter fortresses with heavy rams built from iron and timber. They created pontoons to cross rivers, and even used psychological tactics, marching prisoners before armies to demoralize defenders. Each campaign was planned with mathematical precision. Scouts mapped terrain, spies infiltrated cities, and scribes documented every move. Their military system was supported by an equally ruthless administration. The empire was divided into provinces, each ruled by a governor appointed by the king. These governors collected taxes, conscripted soldiers, and ensured absolute loyalty. A network of roads connected the vast lands of the empire, allowing messages to travel at astonishing speed. Couriers on horseback carried clay tablets sealed with the royal emblem. Orders from Nineveh could reach the farthest frontier within days. This efficiency made rebellion nearly impossible. By the time whispers of revolt began, Assyrian troops were already marching. But while the empire thrived on fear, it also depended on intellect. The Assyrians were not just warriors. They were engineers, architects, and administrators. Their cities were marvels of organization: straight streets, fortified gates, aqueducts that brought water from distant mountains, and palaces that defied imagination. The capital of Nimrud, built by Ashur-nasir-pal II, became a statement to the world. Assyria was not merely powerful. It was divine. Its walls stretched for miles, its temples glittered with gold and alabaster, and its halls were lined with winged bulls, symbols of power and protection. Each stone carried a message: "I am the king who ruled all lands." Then came Tiglath-Pileser III, the man who turned this system into a masterpiece. He saw that power without structure collapses under its own weight. So he reformed everything: the military, the government, the economy. He replaced hereditary officials with loyal servants of the crown, ensuring no noble could challenge royal authority. He introduced standardized ranks, fixed taxes, and conscription laws that filled the army with disciplined soldiers. He expanded Assyria's borders from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, crushing every opponent in his path. His policies transformed Assyria from a regional kingdom into the first true empire of the ancient world. Under him, entire populations were deported and resettled, not as punishment, but as policy. This tactic weakened rebellious regions and populated others with loyal subjects. Thousands of people, craftsmen, farmers, soldiers, were uprooted and sent across the empire to rebuild conquered lands in Assyria's image. It was control by displacement, a form of social engineering centuries ahead of its time. To the outside world, it looked like cruelty. To the Assyrians, it was order. When Tiglath-Pileser's successors came, they inherited not just a throne, but a machine that no longer needed guidance. It only needed fuel. Sargon the Second continued his legacy, leading campaigns into Urartu and the Levant, building new capitals that rivaled the gods in splendor. His city, Dur-Sharrukin, was designed as a perfect vision of power. Immense walls, monumental gateways guarded by colossal Lamassu statues, and palaces filled with reliefs depicting his victories. It was as if he had built not a city, but a declaration of immortality. Yet his life ended on the battlefield, a reminder that even gods could bleed. His son, Sennacherib, took the empire to even greater heights. His campaigns were legendary, his cruelty infamous. When the city of Babylon rebelled, he destroyed it completely. Temples, walls, houses, everything reduced to ash. He redirected rivers over its ruins, erasing it from existence. To him, rebellion was not resistance, but insult, and insults to the king were insults to the divine. Yet for all his brutality, Sennacherib was also a visionary builder. He made Nineveh the jewel of the empire, constructing massive palaces, advanced irrigation systems, and gardens so lush that they were said to rival paradise. His son, Esarhaddon, rebuilt Babylon out of guilt or politics, perhaps both, showing that even in this empire of iron, humanity flickered. But his reign was no less ambitious. He expanded into Egypt, bringing the Assyrian banner to the land of the pharaohs. No empire before had stretched so far, commanded so many nations, or held such unshakable power. And yet it was Ashurbanipal, the last great king, who embodied the empire's peak and its fatal flaw. Ashurbanipal was not just a warrior. He was a scholar. He loved knowledge as much as conquest. His library in Nineveh became the greatest repository of wisdom the ancient world had ever seen. Over 30,000 tablets were collected. Laws, medical texts, astronomy charts, myths, prayers, and the Epic of Gilgamesh itself. He saw knowledge as power and power as divinity, but beneath this brilliance lay arrogance. He believed himself untouchable, the true king of the universe. Under Ashurbanipal, the empire reached its zenith. Tribute flowed from every corner of the known world: gold from Egypt, cedar from Lebanon, lapis from Persia, ivory from Africa. Cities bowed, kings trembled, and Assyria stood as the unchallenged master of the ancient Near East. But the perfection of the machine carried within it the seed of destruction. The empire's vastness demanded constant warfare to sustain it. The economy relied on tribute, the army on conquest, the bureaucracy on obedience. The Assyrian system was like a heart that could never stop beating. The moment it paused, it would die. Even as they built higher walls and richer palaces, cracks began to form. The very terror that had kept enemies obedient now made them desperate. Rebellions flared, alliances formed, and hatred brewed in silence. Within the empire, the elite grew decadent, rulers distant, and the people exhausted. The machine that once drove them forward began to grind against itself. And yet, at the height of its glory, the empire appeared eternal. The Assyrian kings looked out from their palaces and believed they had mastered time. They saw their enemies scattered, their monuments unshaken, their cities glimmering with divine light. They did not see the storm gathering beyond the horizon, the same storm that every empire ignores until it is too late. The Assyrian Empire had become the first great engine of power, efficient, organized, and merciless. It had rewritten the rules of domination, teaching the world that fear could be manufactured and maintained like iron. But every engine overheats. Every flame that burns brightest also consumes itself. The Assyrians had built something too vast, too perfect, too dependent on victory to ever rest. Their own creation would soon devour them. The machine of empire had reached its limit, and history was waiting to claim its debt. The great empire that once stretched from Egypt to Persia From the Mediterranean to the mountains of Iran began to tremble under its own shadow. For centuries, the Assyrians had ruled through fear, and fear, as they had taught the world, was the strongest weapon known to man. But they forgot one truth. Fear cannot be controlled forever. It consumes both the master and the slave. When Ashurbanipal, the last great king, died around 627 BCE, the heart of the empire began to decay. There was no single successor strong enough to inherit his power, no king wise enough to maintain balance between ambition and survival. His death left a vacuum that no man could fill, and in that vacuum, the seeds of destruction began to bloom. Assyria's system had been built on absolute control. Every province tightly governed, every subject watched, every enemy crushed. But control requires constant energy, constant vigilance. And by now the empire was exhausted. Decades of endless warfare had drained its resources and weakened its people. Soldiers who once marched proudly for the glory of Ashur now served out of obligation and fear. The vast machine that had once driven conquest now faltered, choking on its own weight. Roads that had carried messengers of war and tribute became paths for rebellion. The empire that had ruled over nations for centuries began to unravel from within. The royal court of Nineveh, once the center of civilization, turned into a nest of intrigue and corruption. Generals plotted against each other, priests argued over divine legitimacy, and governors in distant lands began to act as kings of their own domains. Gold, which once symbolized power, now fueled greed. The nobles feasted while the common people starved. The very infrastructure that had made Assyria mighty, its administrative complexity, became its curse. The farther its reach, the harder it became to hold. The empire that had once prided itself on discipline now teetered on chaos. Meanwhile, outside its borders, old enemies began to stir. The Babylonians, once humbled and crushed, rose again under a new leader, Nabopolassar, a man driven by vengeance and vision. In the east, the Medes, fierce mountain warriors united under King Cyaxares, also sought retribution for the centuries of Assyrian domination. For generations, these nations had lived in fear of the Assyrian sword, but now they smelled blood in the air. They saw weakness, division, and exhaustion. The perfect moment to strike. By 615 BCE, the Medes struck first, sweeping through northern territories and laying siege to the ancient city of Ashur. For the first time in centuries, the sacred city, the birthplace of Assyrian identity and the home of their god, faced invasion. The defenders fought desperately, knowing that losing Ashur meant losing their soul. But the attackers were relentless. The city fell, its temples looted, its walls torn down, and its people slaughtered. The god Ashur, once thought invincible, was silenced. The fall of Ashur sent a shockwave through the empire. It was more than a military loss. It was psychological collapse. The invincible empire had been wounded at its heart. The Assyrians, however, did not yield easily. They rallied under a new ruler, Ashur-uballit II, and fortified Nineveh, determined to hold on to their capital no matter the cost. The once mighty city, with its towering walls and flowing canals, became a fortress of defiance. Every man capable of fighting was armed, every grain of wheat rationed, every temple turned into a stronghold. But outside the walls, the enemy grew stronger. The Babylonians and Medes, once rivals, joined forces in a deadly alliance. It was the ultimate irony. The empire that had built its power on crushing alliances now fell victim to one. In 612 BCE, the Great Siege of Nineveh began. The combined armies of Babylon, Media, and Scythia surrounded the city. The air was thick with smoke and ash as siege engines rolled across the plains. The rivers that once nourished Nineveh became tools of its destruction. Enemy engineers diverted the waters of the Tigris to weaken the city's defenses. For months, the Assyrians held out, their walls echoing with cries of defiance and despair. But even the strongest walls cannot stand forever when the will behind them is broken. When the final breach came, it was apocalyptic. The enemy poured into the city from all directions, setting fire to everything in their path. Flames devoured palaces that had once glittered with gold. Statues of kings and gods melted under the heat, their faces distorted into expressions of horror. The great library of Ashurbanipal, filled with the wisdom of the ages, was consumed by fire and dust. The streets ran red with blood, and the cries of the dying mingled with the collapsing of stone. For 3 days and 3 nights Nineveh burned, a funeral pyre for the empire of fear. When the fires finally died, there was nothing left but silence. The empire that had once ruled the known world was gone. Its cities were ashes, its kings forgotten, its gods abandoned. The conquerors divided its lands, carving up Assyria's legacy among themselves. Babylon rose as the new power in the region, building its own empire on the bones of its former master. To the Medes, the fall of Assyria was divine justice. The gods had avenged the oppressed. To history, it was the inevitable end of all empires that rise too high. What made the fall of Assyria so absolute was not just the loss of land, but the loss of identity. Unlike Egypt or Persia, which endured through culture and memory, Assyria vanished almost completely. Its name became a curse whispered in foreign tongues. For centuries, the world forgot the cities of Ashur, Nineveh, and Nimrud. The mighty kings who had once called themselves rulers of the 4 corners of the earth became shadows in broken stone. Even their monuments, buried beneath centuries of sand, seemed to mock their ambition. Yet, their legacy did not truly disappear. The systems they created, military organization, provincial governance, psychological warfare, became templates for future empires. The Babylonians learned administration from them, the Persians inherited their road systems and postal networks, and even Rome echoed their strategies of expansion and control. Assyria's methods outlived Assyria itself. The iron hand that once ruled Mesopotamia became the unseen hand guiding the world's future empires. In the quiet that followed their destruction, the ruins of Nineveh stood as a warning. Power, no matter how absolute, carries within it the seed of ruin. The Assyrians had believed they were chosen by the gods, that their dominance was eternal. But even gods fall silent when men mistake conquest for divinity. Their empire had been built not on faith, but on fear. And fear, by its very nature, consumes itself. As centuries passed, their story was buried beneath layers of earth and time, waiting to be rediscovered. When archaeologists finally unearthed the ruins of Nineveh in the 19th century, the world was stunned. The carvings, the tablets, the winged bulls, all spoke of a civilization of unimaginable power and cruelty. It was as if the stones themselves had been waiting to speak again, whispering the same truth the Assyrians had once ignored, that no empire, no matter how mighty, can escape the weight of its own power. The fall of the Assyrian Empire was not just the end of a civilization, it was the closing of an era. With its collapse, the ancient Near East was forever changed. The empire that had once ruled the world vanished, but its shadow remained, a ghost that haunted every empire that dared to follow. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, each would repeat Assyria's story in their own way. And every time, the world would remember the same lesson written in the ashes of Nineveh, that empires rise through strength but fall through arrogance, and that the gods of power are never merciful to their worshippers. In the silence after the storm, the winds of Mesopotamia carried away the last whispers of a vanished empire. The stones cooled, the fires died, and history moved on. But beneath the earth, among the ruins, the Assyrian legacy waited, a story of greatness and ruin, of gods and men, of power and its inevitable fall. For even in their destruction, the Assyrians left behind a message that would outlive them all. That power, once unleashed, never truly dies. It simply changes hands. From the ashes of Nineveh, the dust of empire settled over the world, silent, eternal, and waiting. The Assyrians had mastered the art of domination, yet in their quest to be gods, they forgot what it meant to be human. Their cities turned to shadows, their names buried in forgotten stone, and their glory devoured by time. But their legacy, their relentless pursuit of power, control, and fear, never died. It lived on in the empires that followed, whispering through the corridors of Persia, echoing in the marble halls of Rome, and haunting every nation that dared to rule through fear. For every civilization that rises believes it will last forever, and every one of them ignores the lesson carved into Assyria's ruins. Power is never eternal. It only sleeps, waiting for the next empire bold enough to awaken it. But the question remains, when the next great empire rises, will it too be consumed by its own shadow? Or has history already chosen its next victim? The answer lies buried beneath another forgotten kingdom, one whose secrets still lie waiting beneath the sand.